What would you say to your dying father if you knew it might be the last time you ever saw him? Would you hold his hand, whisper words of love, ask for forgiveness, or offer it? Now imagine walking into that sterile, humming hospital room, past monitors beeping like distant ticking clocks, and telling your father, your only surviving parent, that you couldn't promise you'd ever come back, that you weren't sure you'd return, not even if this was it. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That's what Meghan Markle reportedly told her father, Thomas Markle Sr., as he lay partially paralyzed, unable to speak, surrounded by nurses who had no idea what they were about to witness. What happened in that room, on that day, wasn't just personal. It was historical. It was emotional warfare cloaked in polite words. And now, for the first time, a doctor who claims to have been there is breaking the silence. But before we reveal the exact words, the body language, and the reaction that left medical staff reeling, we need to go back. Because this wasn't a simple hospital visit. This wasn't about closure or compassion. This was the culmination of years of betrayal, miscommunication, media manipulation, and a father's slow descent into heartbreak. And the truth? It's far messier than either side wants to admit. Let's rewind to the beginning. The very beginning. It all started with a letter, or rather, the absence of one. Thomas Markle wasn't just another tabloid dad trying to cash in on his daughter's fame. At least, that's not how he sees it. He was a retired Emmy-winning lighting director. He once lit the sets of Married with Children, the kind of quiet behind-the-scenes career that never sought the spotlight. Until Meghan's engagement to Prince Harry catapulted everything into a frenzy. Suddenly, paparazzi were parked outside his quiet Mexican home. Suddenly, phone calls were being intercepted. Texts were being leaked. His own health began to spiral under the pressure of media intrusion and the emotional whiplash of being cut off. Imagine watching your daughter, your baby girl, walk down the aisle in front of the world's cameras to become royalty without you by her side. Now imagine that this wasn't because you refused to attend, but because you were uninvited. And the real kicker? You found out through the media, not through her voice, not through a call, but through silence. In that silence, 1,000 wounds festered. So when Thomas suffered a stroke in 2022, collapsing in his seaside home, barely able to call for help, the world waited with bated breath. Would Meghan fly to his bedside? Would this be the dramatic reunion the tabloids had long fantasized about? And for a moment, it looked like it might be. A black SUV pulled up to the hospital. The windows were tinted, the security was tight, and the staff whispered in hushed tones, "It's her." She came. But what happened next wasn't a tearful family reunion. It wasn't an apology or a redemptive hug. According to a doctor who was present, who's now speaking out despite the legal risks, what happened next was cold, calculated, and unforgettable. Before we go there, though, ask yourself, what would make a daughter tell her dying father she couldn't promise to return? Was it pain? Was it pride? Was it punishment? And if Thomas Markle couldn't speak, couldn't respond, what did his eyes say in return? That moment, that sentence, that hesitation. It's the emotional center of this story. But to understand how we got there, we have to trace the steps that led to it. The missed calls, the broken letters, the one-sided interviews, the lawsuits, the royal protocol that silenced even the messiest of family dramas. And of course, Meghan's own journey, from LA. Actress to Duchess of Sussex to global celebrity navigating motherhood, racism, and a media machine she once claimed nearly destroyed her. Let's be fair. Let's be honest. Meghan has her side, her pain, her triggers, her traumas. But does any of it justify walking into that hospital room and uttering that sentence? "You know I can't promise I'll come back." Those 9 words have become infamous among hospital staff who claim they overheard them. Whispers that started with a nurse, repeated by an orderly, and eventually confirmed by a doctor willing to risk his job to speak the truth. But even those words, chilling as they sound, weren't the worst part. Because what came after is what truly left the room in stunned silence. The subtle dig, the veiled goodbye, the final line that made the nurse in the corner start to cry. And yet, Meghan didn't flinch. According to this source, she stood, adjusted her coat, gave a half nod to the staff, and walked out. No kiss, no hand squeeze, no backward glance. This isn't just about a fractured father-daughter relationship. This is about image versus intention, publicity versus privacy, and a daughter who built a brand on empathy, yet may have delivered one of the coldest farewells imaginable. But let's pause, because this story is anything but simple. And before you rush to judge Meghan or Thomas, you need to know what they've both been through. The betrayal isn't one-sided. The mistakes weren't made in a vacuum. And perhaps, just perhaps, those 9 haunting words weren't meant to wound. Perhaps they were a whispered cry for boundaries. Or maybe, just maybe, they were a mask for guilt so heavy it couldn't be carried into that room. So what did Meghan really mean? And why did the doctor who heard her feel compelled to speak out, knowing full well the palace, the Sussex lawyers, and the public would come for him? The answer lies in the details, in the posture, the pace, the temperature of the room, and most chillingly, in the look on Thomas Markle's face when he heard it. Because he didn't just hear his daughter say she might never return. He felt it, and that feeling, according to the doctor, was one of pure, soul-crushing defeat. And yet, even that wasn't the end. Because 4 days later, Thomas was handed a notepad. His fingers trembled. His vision was blurry. But he managed to write 4 words. And when Meghan's team saw those words, everything changed. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What makes a daughter stay silent for 4 years, even as her father begs, pleads, and publicly falls apart? Before Meghan Markle stood over Thomas Markle's hospital bed, before she uttered those haunting words, "You know I can't promise I'll come back," she made another, quieter decision. She didn't pick up the phone. She didn't send a letter. She didn't respond to the countless public appeals from her father. Why? That's the question we need to answer. Because this wasn't a sudden estrangement. This wasn't a clean break. This was a slow, aching unraveling of a bond that had once seemed unshakable. A bond that began in childhood, stretched across continents, and then snapped on the global stage. Let's rewind the clock to before the palace, before the tabloids, before Harry. Long before The Cut, Oprah, Netflix, or Spotify. Let's go back to Meghan and her dad, just a father and daughter in Los Angeles. Not royalty, not rebels, just 2 people who, for a long time, had each other's backs. Thomas Markle was there through it all, from Meghan's Catholic school days to her early auditions. He paid for her private education. He coached her through stage fright. He sent money when she needed rent, groceries, gas. He was proud, obsessively proud. His fridge was reportedly covered in her school awards, headshots, and printouts from her early Suits press. He adored her, and according to every interview he gave, that love never went away. Not when she joined the royal family. Not when she left it. Not even when she cut him out. So what had happened? The first real cracks appeared in 2018, in the run-up to the royal wedding. That's when the machinery kicked in. Paparazzi, private investigators, tabloid deals. Text messages leaked to the press. Suddenly, Thomas wasn't just Meghan's dad. He was content. B-roll, scandal fodder. And Meghan? She was furious. Or, maybe, humiliated. Because the image she was trying to project, poised, elegant, untouched by tabloid sleaze, was suddenly being undercut by her own flesh and blood. Thomas admitted to staging photos. Remember that? Shots of him getting fitted for a wedding suit, reading books about Britain, preparing for the royal life. All staged. All sold. All fake. But was it sinister? Or just sad? He later claimed he did it to rehabilitate his image. That he felt hounded, mocked, called a slob. That he wanted the world to see he cared. That he was proud. That he was trying. But to Meghan, it wasn't just a misstep. It was betrayal. The palace, too, allegedly panicked. They reportedly offered to manage him, to keep him out of trouble. But Thomas didn't trust the firm. He wanted to speak for himself. He said as much in interviews. Dozens of them, over the next year. That's when the silence began. Meghan stopped calling. She stopped texting. She ghosted. And Thomas? He broke. He started appearing on UK television. He gave quotes to the Daily Mail. He begged her, on camera, to talk to him. He released handwritten notes. He showed receipts, literally, of money he'd sent her. He even said he was willing to fly to London and apologize in person. But she didn't respond. Can you imagine that? Being a father, old, alone, vulnerable. And watching your daughter become one of the most famous women in the world, knowing she's just a plane ride away, but might as well be on the moon? Thomas once said, I made mistakes, but I've paid for them. I've apologized. I've begged. But nothing comes back. It's like she doesn't want a father. Now ask yourself this. What kind of pain turns into that kind of silence? Was Meghan punishing him? Protecting herself? Or simply trying to control the chaos? And then came the wedding. The moment the world expected reconciliation. But instead of walking her down the aisle, Thomas was at home, recovering from heart surgery. Or so the story went. But even that was mired in mystery. Some claim the heart attack was real. Others said it was exaggerated to avoid a PR disaster. Either way, Thomas didn't show. Meghan walked alone, then met Charles at the halfway mark. A symbolic gesture, perhaps, but also a line in the sand. The press spun it hard. Meghan abandons her dad. Markle family circus. The outsider father. Thomas, hurt and confused, retaliated with interviews. He accused Harry of being rude. Said he felt cut off. Begged for contact. Still nothing. No calls. No letters. Not even through intermediaries. The silence was total. Icy. Absolute. And it stayed that way for years. Until 2022. When the stroke hit. That's when the tone shifted. Suddenly, the media was watching again. Would Meghan come? Would she ignore him again? As he hovered between life and death, the Markle camp was quiet. Strategic. No public statements. No denials. No confirmations. But behind the scenes, sources say there was movement. A call. A flight. A plan. And one quiet visit. No press. No cameras. Just Meghan and the man she hadn't seen in 4 years. It was supposed to be private. But hospitals have ears. And eyes. And now, finally, one of those witnesses is ready to talk. But before we get to what Meghan said in that room, we have to understand what she walked into. Because Thomas wasn't the man she remembered. His face was drooping from the stroke. His speech was slurred or non-existent. He was weak, helpless, and yet, according to a nurse, his eyes lit up when she walked in. He tried to reach for her hand. She didn't take it. Instead, she stood beside the bed, said hello, and according to one staff member, remained standing. She didn't sit, didn't cry, didn't touch him. She reportedly looked around the room, then asked for a moment alone. The nurse stepped out, confused, but didn't go far. She lingered by the door, and that's when she heard it. 9 words. You know I can't promise I'll come back. The nurse wasn't the only one. An orderly later corroborated it, and the doctor, who eventually filed an anonymous report, confirmed the tone was unsettling. Not angry, not warm, just cold. Meghan said it as if it were a fact, a formality, a boundary. But to Thomas, lying half-conscious, it might as well have been a goodbye. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one spoke. No machines beeped. And then, Meghan turned. She left the room. But the story didn't end there. Because 4 days later, Thomas, still recovering, was handed a notepad. He wrote something. And what he scribbled, in shaky, desperate handwriting, made one nurse cry and changed how everyone in that hospital remembered that day. Because it wasn't just a response. It was the beginning of something much darker. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does it feel like to realize your body is failing, and you might die without ever hearing from your child again? Thomas Markle's stroke didn't just paralyze part of his face. It froze a narrative that had been spiraling out of control for years. It stopped Meghan Markle's silence in its tracks. It forced a reckoning, one that could no longer be dodged, delayed, or buried under PR gloss. Because this wasn't a metaphorical collapse. This was a literal one. And when Thomas hit the floor of his modest home in Rosarito, Mexico, clutching his chest and slurring nonsense, there was no royal aid to call. No security detail to rush in. No crisis team to contain the damage. There was just a man, alone, broken, and seconds from death. Now imagine you're Meghan, hundreds of miles away, living in Montecito, safe, comfortable, respected, and someone tells you, maybe a publicist, maybe a distant cousin, that your father has collapsed and is being rushed to a foreign hospital. Do you panic? Do you rush to his side? Or do you pause, calculate, and ask, is it real this time? Because by then, the water had already been muddied. Thomas had already claimed a heart attack before the wedding, and some said that was a lie. Others believed it. But in either case, the story had changed. The trust was gone. And now, A new emergency was unfolding, one that no one could ignore. The 911 call came at 9:21 p.m. Neighbors had heard a thud, a crash. Thomas reportedly collapsed near the kitchen counter, clutching a chair before hitting the tile. An ambulance arrived 11 minutes later. By then, he couldn't speak. His mouth twisted, his left eye twitching, unable to answer basic questions. The paramedics thought it might be a stroke, but they needed scans to confirm. He was rushed to the nearest hospital, just across the border, in San Diego. The next 24 hours were chaos. Doctors confirmed it was an ischemic stroke caused by a clot. They administered blood thinners, began physical assessments, and placed Thomas in a semi-private recovery room. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because despite Thomas's inability to speak, hospital staff reported he kept gesturing to a notepad, scribbling words. One nurse later revealed he wrote Meghan repeatedly, underlined, circled, desperate. He wanted her. Not a lawyer. Not a doctor. Not Samantha. Not TMZ. Just Meghan. The daughter who had vanished from his life 4 years ago. And now, he was pleading with nurses to call her. But here's the gut punch. No one knew how to reach her. There was no emergency contact on file. No assistant number. No press agent who answered. Even the British consulate was reportedly confused. Meghan and Harry weren't technically royals anymore. They weren't bound by the palace. They weren't bound by anything. And so, the only way to reach her was the media. That's when the headlines began. Thomas Markle hospitalized after stroke. Meghan's father pleads to see her. Final goodbye? Sources say Thomas can no longer speak. The story exploded. And for the first time in a long time, Meghan reacted. Not publicly, but internally, something shifted. We know this because security sources confirmed an inquiry was made to the hospital. A lawyer reportedly called under a private name, asked about visitor protocols, wanted to confirm Thomas's location. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a rush to her father's side. But it was something. The world waited. And then, it happened. An unmarked black vehicle arrived at the hospital 2 days later. Security got tense. The lobby was cleared. And staff, peeking through doorways, saw her. Hair pulled back. Dark clothes. Sunglasses. Meghan Markle. In the flesh. Walking toward the ICU. She didn't bring flowers. She didn't bring Archie. Or Lilibet. She brought only herself. And the weight of 4 years of silence. Nurses whispered. Orderlies stopped pushing carts. One doctor, who had only known Thomas for 2 days, said he felt a strange tension enter the air. It wasn't just emotional. It was theatrical, because Meghan didn't slip in unnoticed. She moved with the calm, deliberate grace of someone who knew all eyes were on her and didn't flinch. And yet, behind the composure, something else stirred. Was it shame? Guilt? Fear? No one could say. But Thomas's eyes, when he saw her, reportedly lit up. He couldn't speak, but his body language was unmistakable. He tried to raise his right hand. It trembled. He tried to sit up. He couldn't. But his face, half paralyzed, half smiling, cracked into something that looked like relief, like recognition, like hope. Then Meghan stopped by the foot of the bed, didn't move closer, didn't take his hand. Instead, she looked around the room. 2 nurses, 1 monitor technician, an on-call physician. And then she spoke. I'd like a moment alone with him. The staff nodded, stepped out, except one. One nurse lingered, not out of defiance, but concern. She stayed near the door, just far enough to respect privacy, just close enough to hear. And that's when it happened. The sentence that still sends chills down her spine. You know I can't promise I'll come back. 9 words. Not shouted. Not whispered. Just stated. Calmly. Coldly. Clearly. The nurse blinked. Thought she'd misheard. But then she saw Thomas's reaction. He flinched. His good eye blinked rapidly. His hand twitched, reaching again. Meghan didn't move. She stood there for what felt like minutes. Then, according to the nurse, she said one more thing. Something softer. Something less clear. But the word boundaries was heard. And just like that, she left. Didn't ask for a medical update. Didn't hug him. Didn't linger. The room was quiet again. Quieter than ever. Thomas lay still. And hours later, he was handed a notepad. His hand trembled. His fingers could barely hold the pen. But he managed to write 4 words. I love you anyway. A nurse later said she couldn't finish her shift after reading it. Because that wasn't just a message. It was a surrender. A father's final olive branch, offered from a hospital bed, after a daughter walked away. But here's the twist. Meghan hadn't left the building yet. Security sources say she was in a private lounge when that note was written. Someone tried to show it to her. And her response? A quiet shake of the head. No comment. No reaction. She walked out minutes later. Head high. Expression unreadable. And that might have been the end. But the story didn't fade. Because the doctor who treated Thomas, who watched all this unfold, was about to do something no one expected. He was about to speak out. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What happens when a hospital room becomes a war zone? Not of bullets or bombs, but of unspoken words, buried pain, and decades of emotional shrapnel. This was no ordinary visit. And this was no ordinary daughter. When Meghan Markle stepped into Thomas Markle's hospital room, she didn't just cross a threshold of sterile tiles and white walls. She crossed into a space already charged with unshed tears, shattered expectations, and a staff that, unknowingly, was about to become witness to one of the most emotionally jarring encounters they would ever experience. Hospitals are supposed to be sacred, quiet, neutral, but on that day, it felt more like a stage. Let's back up. Just hours before Meghan arrived, the nurses had been briefed. A woman would be arriving to visit Mr. Markle. She would be escorted by 2 security professionals. She did not want media. She did not want attention. She would not be taking questions. The instructions were clear. But what the staff wasn't prepared for was her. Meghan walked in with the stillness of a woman in control. Her heels didn't click too loudly. Her coat didn't flutter dramatically. But there was something in her walk, measured, tense, controlled, that caught everyone off guard. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't fragile. She was composed, focused, almost clinical. And in that moment, the hospital changed. Nurses stopped talking in the hallway. A janitor paused mid-mop. Even the receptionist, who didn't watch The Crown and didn't care much for celebrity news, admitted later that the air got heavier. Meghan wasn't there to heal old wounds. She was there for a reason. But what that reason was, no one knew. Until she entered room 214. Thomas Markle was awake, but sedated. One side of his face drooped. His speech, still absent, had been replaced by glances, grunts, and frantic notepad scribbles. Earlier that day, he'd asked nurses repeatedly, in messy handwriting, "Is she coming?" They didn't know who she was at first. But when Meghan arrived, everything clicked. Nurse JL, a soft-spoken woman in her 40s, later recalled the way Thomas's eye widened when she stepped in. He tried to reach for her. He really tried. His hand lifted, trembled, froze halfway in the air. But Meghan didn't reach back. Instead, she nodded. A tiny, almost imperceptible nod. And then she turned to the nurse and said calmly, "Can we have a moment alone?" Nurse JL nodded and stepped out. But she didn't go far. Something told her, intuition maybe, that she needed to stay near the door. That's when the temperature dropped. Not literally, but emotionally, something shifted. Inside that room, the silence grew thick. Not warm silence. Not the kind that comes before reconciliation. This was loaded silence. The kind that carries years of things left unsaid. And then, Meghan spoke. "You know I can't promise I'll come back." No tremble in her voice. No cracks. Just a sentence. Flat. Final. Devastating. But it wasn't the words alone that shocked the nurse just outside. It was the delivery. The tone. Detached. Quiet. Defensive. Somewhere between a boundary and a threat. And Thomas? He twitched, blinking rapidly, trying to respond, trying to process. But no words came out. Just a moan. A gasp. A futile attempt to sit upright. But Meghan didn't move. She didn't comfort him. Didn't apologize. Didn't say, "I love you." She said something else. The nurse couldn't hear it all, but the word boundaries was clear. And then, Meghan stepped back. Still silent. Still distant. At that moment, a young resident doctor happened to walk by and glance through the window on the door. What he saw made him freeze. Meghan was standing stiffly. Thomas was sobbing, silently. A tear rolled down the side of his cheek. His mouth opened like he was trying to say something. But she didn't wipe it away. Didn't even acknowledge it. She stood like someone bracing for a storm that had already passed. Moments later, she pressed the call button. A nurse returned. Meghan whispered something and left. She didn't say goodbye. Didn't look back. The hallway was silent as she walked past. And then came the fallout. The nurse who had lingered outside was visibly shaken. Her hands were trembling as she wrote her notes. Another nurse, who entered the room moments later, found Thomas attempting to write again, shakily, frantically. He wrote, "Why did she say that?" And then, "Tell her. I'm sorry." Those notes were handed to Meghan's security team, who had been waiting outside. They reportedly declined to pass them on. "I think she said what she needed to say," one of them allegedly told the nurse. But that didn't sit well with the staff. Not with the doctor who had seen the encounter. Not with the nurse who had heard it. Something about the visit lingered. It wasn't just awkward. It was haunting. Nurse JL later told a colleague, "That wasn't a daughter visiting her sick father. That was a statement." But what kind of statement? Was Meghan there for closure? For optics? For guilt? Or was she there because someone forced her? Here's where the story gets murky. According to one off-the-record source, Meghan's visit wasn't entirely voluntary. A legal advisor reportedly urged her to go, citing potential reputational fallout if Thomas died and she hadn't visited. Another claimed a PR executive had strongly suggested it was time to be seen as human again. But if that's true, it raises another question. Was her visit an act of love or damage control? And if it was damage control, why risk saying that sentence? Why not pretend? Why not smile, hug, whisper sweet nothings, and leave the world none the wiser? Why walk into that room and drop a bomb? Because that's what she did. She detonated something. And the shockwave hasn't settled. You might be wondering, where was Harry in all this? Did he support the visit? Did he want her to go? Or was this part of some larger Sussex strategy? The truth is, no one really knows. Harry wasn't seen at the hospital. He didn't comment publicly. There were whispers that he stayed home to avoid escalating tensions. Others say he never wanted her to go at all. But Meghan went. Alone. And she left Thomas more broken than before. That night, staff rotated out in shifts. But the conversation kept circling back to that room. What was said, how it was said, what it meant. By morning, one of the younger doctors had drafted a private memo. Not for legal reasons. Not for the press. But because he couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. He called it unethical emotional distancing in a vulnerable patient context. He wasn't accusing Meghan of malpractice, but he was documenting what he believed was a psychological injury. That memo would later become the foundation of something far bigger, because it didn't stay private. It leaked. And once that happened, the dam broke. Other staff came forward. Other details emerged. The whispers turned into statements. And the media, hungry for anything Sussex-related, smelled blood. But what came next wasn't just gossip. It was a bombshell. Because buried in the doctor's memo was a detail no one expected. A line that hinted Meghan didn't come on her own. That someone else may have ordered her to make the visit. And what they said to her, before she entered that room, might explain everything. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Why would a doctor risk their entire career to speak out about a patient they barely knew? Unless the weight of what they witnessed haunted them so deeply, they couldn't sleep without reliving it. Hospitals are bound by strict codes, confidentiality, ethics, professional detachment. But what happens when a doctor is faced not just with physical illness, but with emotional cruelty? When the person standing over a patient's bed isn't there to heal, but to hurt? Quietly, surgically, with a smile and a sentence? That's the dilemma one physician faced after Meghan Markle's visit to her father's hospital room. His name has never been publicly released. In reports, he's referred to only as Dr. L. But those who've worked with him describe him as competent, empathetic, professional, someone who doesn't rattle easily. So why, after treating thousands of patients, did this moment push him over the edge? Let's go back. Dr. L had been on rotation for 16 hours when Meghan arrived. He wasn't starstruck. He barely recognized her. To him, Thomas Markle was just another patient in a recovery room. A stroke victim with partial paralysis, recovering slowly from trauma. At first, he didn't even know Thomas was Meghan's father. But then the guards arrived. The energy shifted. And suddenly, Dr. L found himself in the middle of something far bigger than patient charts and CT scans. He remembers seeing Meghan step into the room. Quiet, elegant, poised. And then the change. He describes the room's atmosphere turning dense, like something unspoken had followed her inside. At first, he tried to give privacy. He stepped out, took notes, reviewed labs. But something bothered him. He says he heard raised voices, not shouting, but tension. He peeked through the observation window and saw Thomas struggling to speak, his hands flailing, his face twitching in distress. Meghan stood near the door, arms folded, emotionless. When he returned after the visit, the nurses were whispering. One was crying. The orderly who'd been delivering supplies had gone pale. Everyone had heard it. "You know, I can't promise I'll come back." Dr. L asked the staff what happened, and when he heard the details, he felt sick. Not because it was unprofessional. Meghan wasn't under hospital rules. She could say whatever she wanted. But because, according to him, it was inhuman. He wrote a note in Thomas's file that night. Emotional distress exacerbated by visitor interaction. Recommend monitoring psychological response over next 48 hours. He was careful, clinical, vague, but he couldn't shake it. That night, Dr. L didn't sleep. He kept replaying the interaction. Thomas's twitching hands, his tear, Meghan's calm tone, and he kept asking himself the same question. Why would she come all this way just to say that? Then came the moment that pushed him over the edge. 2 days later, Thomas scribbled a note. "I love her. I always did." And when Dr. L saw it, he felt something shift in him. Because he realized this man was dying emotionally, not just physically. The next day, Dr. L began typing a document. It wasn't part of the hospital's medical record system. It wasn't sanctioned, but it was real. 3 pages. Bullet points. Observations. He titled it, Non-Clinical Observations, Markle Incident. In it, he described Meghan's body language. Stiff, guarded, distant. Her tone, neutral, clipped, occasionally sarcastic. Her sentence, "You know, I can't promise I'll come back." Her follow-up comment, "This doesn't change anything." He wrote that Thomas showed visible psychological distress and attempted repeated engagement that was met with emotional detachment. But here's the part that no one saw coming. At the end of the report, Dr. L added a paragraph. It read, "Staff heard MS. Markle referenced being told to do this and being forced into a moment she didn't agree with. Implies external pressure to make visit." That changed everything, because it suggested Meghan hadn't come out of guilt. She hadn't come to reconcile. She hadn't come because she wanted to. She came because someone made her. So who? And why? That question triggered a hospital-wide stir. Whispers turned to speculation. Was it a legal threat? A PR advisor? A family member? Was Harry involved? Or even more scandalously, was the palace? Theories erupted like wildfire. Dr. L didn't speculate, but he did act. He submitted his memo, anonymously, to the hospital's ethics board. And then he vanished from the story. Gone. Quiet. No interviews. But the document? It leaked. First, to an internal email list. Then to an outside journalist. Then, within days, to the Daily Spectacle, a niche gossip site with a track record of exposing hush-hush royal leaks. They ran with it. Doctor blows whistle on Meghan Markle's chilling hospital visit. The story exploded. Other media outlets hesitated. Lawyers circled. But the story had legs. More nurses came forward. Anonymous quotes flooded Reddit threads, X posts, Telegram chats. Some called it fake. Others said it was too detailed not to be true. A former royal aide commented under a pseudonym, "Not surprised. It's what we dealt with every day behind the scenes." Suddenly, the question wasn't what Meghan said. It was, who told her to go? Who told her to make a cold, scripted appearance? Was it Harry? A Netflix advisor? A crisis manager? One insider claimed she was advised that if she didn't visit Thomas and he died, her brand would suffer irreparable damage. Another source claimed that an upcoming Spotify project had received internal backlash over her treatment of family, pressuring her team to make a move. Either way, the visit was framed not as healing, but as strategy. And Meghan? She played her part. Clean coat. No tears. A scripted line. Then out. But the doctor saw through it. He wasn't a royal watcher. He wasn't a gossip fan. He was a man who watched a daughter emotionally gut her father in a room where he should have felt safe. And in the days that followed, Dr. L resigned. Not in disgrace. In protest. He didn't want to work somewhere that swept pain under the rug, that ignored emotional trauma because it wasn't in a lab test. He moved to another clinic. Far from cameras. But his memo lived on. And its final line still rings in the ears of everyone who's read it. What I witnessed was not a family reunion. It was a performance, and it left more scars than any surgery ever could. But even that wasn't the end, because someone else read that memo. Someone who had their own file, their own timeline, their own revenge, and they were about to release it to the world. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Why would anyone choose those words? Out of all the phrases in the English language, why pick the one sentence that could shatter a dying father's heart? Let's sit with it for a moment. You know, I can't promise I'll come back. Not I love you. Not I'm sorry. Not I wish things were different. Just that. Cold. Clinical. Distant. A line that sounds rehearsed, sanitized, pre-approved. Not something from the heart, but something from a strategy deck. And that's precisely why this sentence has haunted the staff at that San Diego hospital, and now the public, for months. Because it didn't feel like a farewell. It felt like a legal disclaimer. A PR boundary wrapped in grief. But here's the twist no one expected. This wasn't the first time Meghan Markle had used this kind of language with her father. In fact, multiple insiders now claim that Meghan had said nearly identical words in a voicemail to Thomas years earlier, during the height of the royal wedding drama in 2018. According to a close family contact, Thomas received a short, tight message from Meghan that year. It went something like this. Dad, I hope you're well. I'm sorry things have gotten so complicated. I can't promise we'll talk again anytime soon, but I wish you peace. Sound familiar? Even then, the choice of words carried distance, politeness, precision, not warmth. It's as if Meghan had long ago decided she couldn't allow herself to be vulnerable with him. Not after what she viewed as betrayal. The interviews, the paparazzi deals, the emotional blackmail, as she described it in her now famous letter. So maybe, in her mind, those words were protective. A boundary. A wall meant to protect her from a father who she believed sold her out. But from Thomas's side, it was a death sentence. Let's go back to the hospital. He was lying there, motionless on the left side, vision blurred, lips barely able to twitch into expression. And then his daughter, the woman he once called his pearl, walked in, looked him in the eye, and said it. You know, I can't promise I'll come back. According to the doctor, the way she said it mattered even more than the words themselves. She wasn't angry. She wasn't emotional. She was resolved. Like someone checking a task off a list. Thomas tried to respond. He flailed his right hand. The four tugged. A monitor beeped sharply. But she didn't take his hand. She didn't sit. She didn't even flinch. She just stood there, arms gently folded, as if the very act of entering the room was the full extent of what she could offer. And that's when she spoke again. This part was only partially audible through the glass pane in the hospital hallway, but multiple staff heard snippets. According to Nurse JL, Meghan said, "This doesn't mean I'm letting you back in." And then, softly, "This is all I can give." Now imagine hearing that from your only child, after a stroke, after days of scribbling her name on notepads, after crying silently in your sleep. Can you even picture that level of devastation? But here's where it gets more complicated. Because a hospital technician, who entered the room minutes after Meghan left, claims that Thomas scribbled something down before they could even check his vitals. For words, "Why is she cold?" He wrote it twice. Once shakily, then again, underlined. And then beneath that, in smaller writing, "Tell her I'm sorry." A broken plea. But here's the thing, Meghan never got that note. Her team declined it. Flat out. One nurse recalled her bodyguards saying, "Ms. Markle is not accepting personal messages today." Today. As if that was a policy. As if grieving patients were just fans outside a movie set. And that decision? It didn't sit well with the staff. Especially Dr. L, who by that point had already begun compiling his observations. He noted that Meghan's tone during the visit mirrored emotional detachment consistent with trauma response or intentional boundary setting prompted by third-party advisement. In other words, either she was deeply wounded or she was told to act like this. And now, with multiple sources confirming the line about being told to do this, the theory was growing legs. One anonymous nurse from the third shift recalled hearing Meghan say, almost to herself, "They said this would help." Who is they? Lawyers? Publicists? A streaming executive? Who benefits from a Meghan Markle hospital visit? Let's do the math. At the time of the visit, Meghan and Harry were rumored to be in negotiations with two major media platforms. One podcast deal, one docuseries, both requiring public goodwill and both under scrutiny after poor audience retention. And then, like clockwork, the visit happened. No press, no photo op, but word still leaked. She visited her father. She made the effort. She showed up. And suddenly, the headlines softened. The Meghan image was being rebranded again. From Ice Queen to Wounded Daughter. From diva to dutiful. From distant to forgiving. But behind the scenes, the visit was anything but tender. Because it wasn't just the one sentence. It was the next line. The one no one was supposed to hear. A nurse, standing near the open door, heard Meghan murmur something as she turned to leave. Something that made that nurse's eyes well with tears. Meghan said, "You made your choices. Now I've made mine." That's when the nurse stepped out. Shaken, she told a supervisor. It was documented, not as a formal complaint, but as a staff impact note, something the hospital files when emotionally charged incidents occur. The next morning, another note appeared in Thomas's file. Not from Dr. L. From a psychologist brought in to help stroke patients process trauma. The psychologist noted, patient presents signs of acute emotional distress. Expressed themes of abandonment, guilt, longing. Strong response to family-related stimuli. Recommend monitored contact only with pre-approved visitors. In layman's terms, Thomas shouldn't be left to process this visit alone. It broke him, but it also raised another question. Did Meghan know it would? Was that the point? Was this visit an olive branch, or a final blow? Because sometimes, cruelty doesn't look like shouting. Sometimes, it looks like poise, like silence, like a single sentence, perfectly timed, devastatingly delivered. "You know I can't promise I'll come back." She didn't need to scream. She'd already dropped the bomb. But Thomas wasn't done. The next day, he made a request. He wanted to write one final message to Meghan. It would take him 4 hours, 3 pages, multiple pens. And the words he wrote were never meant to be read publicly, but someone else got their hands on them. And when those pages surfaced, everything changed. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What makes a room feel colder after someone leaves? It wasn't just the words. It wasn't just the silence that followed them. It was the way Meghan Markle exited her father's hospital room, as if she had just completed a chore. As if the emotional wreckage left behind was someone else's mess to clean up. But that's not what truly disturbed the hospital staff. It was something less obvious. Something felt, not seen, not heard. The moment Meghan turned on her heel and left that small, dimly lit room, a nurse standing just outside the door said the air shifted. It was like a weight dropped into the center of the ward. A psychological vacuum. An invisible fog. The monitors beeped slower. The hallway lights flickered. Call it superstition. Call it poetic interpretation. But for those who were there, it was real. The temperature didn't drop. The energy did. Let's go back to that final moment in the room. Thomas had already written 2 notes. "Why is she cold?" and "Tell her I'm sorry." He was weak, eyes watery, confused. And then Meghan stood up. Calmly, smoothly, no rushed breath, no trembling. She looked at him one last time and, according to 2 separate nurses, offered him a slight nod. Not a smile, not a wave, just a nod. And then, just as she reached the door, she said the line that turned whispers into reports, notes into leaks, and gossip into something far more insidious. "You made your choices. Now I've made mine." Then she was gone. Just like that. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it was surgical. Intentional. As if she had trained herself to shut down. To not absorb the pain around her. As if she'd stepped into that room already armored in emotional Kevlar. And that was the moment the room went cold. The nurse, standing nearby, froze. She didn't blink, she later said. She didn't crack. I've seen family members cry over people they barely knew. But she was ice. Dr. L, who was reviewing another patient chart nearby, returned to Thomas's room 10 minutes later. He says what he saw next shook him. Thomas was crying. Not sobbing, crying. One side of his face soaked with tears he couldn't wipe away himself. The monitors showed a spike in blood pressure. His hand trembled as he tried to scribble something again. It took minutes to form one word. Cold. And then another. Why? Dr. L called in a staff counselor. This wasn't physical trauma anymore. This was psychological. The counselor began asking simple questions. What did she say to you? Thomas tried to answer. His mouth fumbled. No sound. So he wrote again. Messy, trembling, barely legible. She said it's over. No more us. It hurt. Now pause and picture this. You're 78 years old, recovering from a stroke, alone, immobilized. And your daughter, the one you adored, protected, funded, cheered for, tells you she might never come back. Tells you there's no more us. Doesn't say I love you. Doesn't offer hope. Doesn't hold your hand. Just delivers the verdict. Like a judge with no appeal. Can you feel that? That sharpness? That finality? That's what the hospital staff felt too. It unsettled them. One nurse had to take the rest of the day off. She told her manager she felt emotionally contaminated. Contaminated. That was the word. Because the visit hadn't cleansed anything. It had infected the room. Infected him. But what came next made it worse. As Meghan left the hospital, down a back hallway, past side doors, accompanied by one security officer, she was spotted by a junior tech. Someone who had no idea what had just happened inside. He reportedly said, she looked like she'd just come from brunch. No puffed eyes. No tension in her jaw. No visible regret. Just calm. Collected. Unmoved. And then, as she passed through the exit, security footage captured something no one expected. This was later described, not shown, by a hospital insider who viewed the security reel. As Meghan paused just before stepping outside, she looked over her shoulder. Not at the camera, not at a person, just behind her. And then she did something strange. She pulled her phone from her coat pocket, typed a quick message, smiled just barely, and walked out. That smile, according to the security guard who watched the footage, was the most unnerving thing he'd ever seen. Why? Because it wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was satisfaction, as if something had gone exactly to plan. This wasn't a woman haunted by a moment of pain. This was a woman who had said what she came to say, and felt justified in doing so. And that revelation? It shattered the narrative. Because up until that moment, the staff had assumed, hoped, that Meghan's visit had been difficult for her too. That it cost her something. That it stirred old emotions. That it cracked something open. But that smile, that nod, that quiet exit, it didn't say heartbreak. It said mission accomplished. Now here's where it gets darker. That night, Thomas's condition dipped. Not physically, but psychologically. He refused to eat. He stopped writing. He lay in bed, eyes closed, flinching when nurses approached. The counselor noted emotional shutdown. Dr. L recorded acute withdrawal. In short, Thomas Markle gave up. Not on life, but on hope. Hope that the rift could be mended. Hope that his daughter might return. And so, the hospital brought in a palliative therapist. Someone trained not just in helping patients die, but in helping them say goodbye. But Thomas couldn't say goodbye, because he hadn't gotten a hello, just a verdict. And that's when the writing began. Not scribbles, not notes. A letter, 3 pages, written slowly, carefully, as if every word might be the last. He asked for a clipboard, a better pen, time alone, and when the nurses returned, the letter was done. He didn't want it read aloud. He wanted it mailed, privately, to Meghan, but it didn't make it to her, because someone else got to it first. And what they did next blew the story wide open, because the letter wasn't kind. It wasn't angry, either. It was worse. It was truthful, unfiltered, unforgiving, devastating. And soon, it was in the hands of someone who wanted revenge. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if a dying man's final letter didn't beg for forgiveness, but exposed a lifetime of manipulation? Thomas Markle's 3-page handwritten letter was supposed to be private. It wasn't an open letter to the press. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It wasn't even supposed to be read by anyone other than Meghan. But somehow, like everything else in this tangled family saga, it slipped into the wrong hands. And when it did, everything exploded. Let's rewind. Just hours after Meghan's chilling hospital visit, Thomas became eerily quiet. Gone were the scribbled questions. Gone were the trembling notes to nurses. Gone were the tears. He was still breathing, still blinking, but emotionally, he was gone. Until the next morning. At sunrise, he asked, using a written note, for a clipboard, paper, and a black ink pen. Nurse AD handed them to him, unsure what he was planning to do. And then, over the next 4 hours, Thomas Markle. Shaky, weak, barely able to grip the pen, began to write. It wasn't neat. It wasn't elegant. But it was clear. 3 full pages. No crossings out. No rewrites. Just a direct download of pain, regret, memory, and something darker. Not anger, but resentment. Because Thomas had reached the end of something. Not just his strength, but his restraint. And what he wrote was raw. The first line, I don't want to die without saying the truth. Not a truth. The truth. And the truth, according to him, was this. You used me when you needed me. And you erased me when you didn't. Boom. That was the second paragraph. Already, we're past the point of reconciliation. Already, we're into something deeper. A father cataloging the moments when he stopped being a parent and became a tool. He continued. You called when you needed help with bills. With tuition. With rent. I gave it every time. Gladly. You were my daughter. That's what fathers do. But when the cameras came, you got scared. Scared I wouldn't fit. Scared I'd ruin the fantasy. So you cut me out. Like I was a bad habit. Like I didn't raise you. Like I was never there. Emotional gut punch after gut punch. Thomas wasn't trying to win her back. He was trying to be heard, maybe for the first time. And then, in the middle of the second page, came this. You talked about toxic family in interviews. About feeling unsafe. About needing space. But you never said it to me. Never to my face. Never even in a letter. You let strangers read your pain before you let your own father understand it. That line hit hard. Because it wasn't just an accusation. It was a contrast. Meghan, who had built a brand on vulnerability, on openness, on trauma sharing, had ghosted the one man who wanted to understand. And then, near the end of the letter, Thomas delivered the line that would later spark a media firestorm. A line that, once leaked, sent Meghan's legal team into a frenzy. You were never acting when you were a child, but you started performing the moment the world gave you a stage. And somewhere in there, you stopped being mine. The word performing stung, because it echoed accusations made by others, critics, family members, even former friends. That Meghan was always on, always strategic, always calculating. But coming from her own father, it landed differently, more intimate, more heartbreaking. The final line of the letter? I'll always love you. But I see you now. And I hope someday you'll see me. He didn't sign it with Dad. He signed it. Thomas. That was the moment the nurse who read it began crying. Not just because of the words, but because of the signature. It was the ultimate heartbreak. The final withdrawal of affection. He wasn't begging for his daughter back. He was letting her go. Now here's where the story spirals into madness. Thomas asked for the letter to be mailed privately. He gave it to a nurse, who passed it to the hospital's admin desk, who logged it for outgoing post. But it never made it to Meghan. Why? Because a family member arrived the next day. Someone who had their own agenda. Samantha Markle. Yes, that's Samantha. The half-sister. The media loudmouth. The self-appointed keeper of the Markle family's real history. She was granted access to the hospital, briefly, after claiming she had power of attorney. That was a lie, but no one verified it in time. And while she was there, she saw the envelope. She took it. She read it. And within 48 hours, excerpts were leaked. First to a fringe UK blog, then to a Royal Watcher podcast, then to tabloids, then to everyone. The letter went viral. #Markle letter trended worldwide. Some were horrified. Others were vindicated. But the media machine? It feasted. Talk show panels dissected every line. Was Meghan really cold? Did she manipulate her father? Is this the smoking gun that proves her brand is built on lies? And Meghan? She said nothing. Her PR team issued a generic statement. Ms. Markle does not comment on private family correspondence, particularly those written in moments of medical distress. But the damage was done. The phrase, "You used me when you needed me," appeared in headlines in over 20 countries. And even her supporters began asking uncomfortable questions. But here's the real twist. The letter didn't just hurt Meghan's image. It destroyed the fragile PR story being crafted behind the scenes. Because just days earlier, select journalists had received leaks, anonymous, of course, painting Meghan's hospital visit as a quiet act of love. Now that narrative was dead, buried under a letter signed Thomas. And while Meghan stayed silent, Samantha did not. She went on talk shows. She held interviews. She waved the letter like a flag. And in one segment, she dropped a bombshell. That's not the only letter. I've got more. More? According to her, Thomas had written multiple drafts, multiple attempts at communication over the years, some emotional, some angry, some downright desperate. And she had them all, locked in a file, ready to use. And if Meghan didn't stop playing victim, as Samantha put it, she'd release them all. It was blackmail, emotional warfare. But in Samantha's eyes, it was justice. And it left Meghan with two choices: respond and risk a brutal public fight, stay silent, and watch her image crumble from the inside out. And in that silence, another figure entered the stage. Someone Meghan didn't expect. Someone who'd been watching all of this unfold from behind palace walls. Someone with their own version of the truth. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does it feel like to realize your body is failing, and you might die without ever hearing from your child again? Thomas Markle's stroke didn't just paralyze part of his face. It froze a narrative that had been spiraling out of control for years. It stopped Meghan Markle's silence in its tracks. It forced a reckoning, one that could no longer be dodged, delayed, or buried under PR gloss. Because this wasn't a metaphorical collapse. This was a literal one. And when Thomas hit the floor of his modest home in Rosarito, Mexico, clutching his chest and slurring nonsense, there was no royal aid to call, no security detail to rush in, no crisis team to contain the damage. There was just a man, alone, broken, and seconds from death. Now imagine you're Meghan, hundreds of miles away, living in Montecito, safe, comfortable, respected, and someone tells you, maybe a publicist, maybe a distant cousin, that your father has collapsed and is being rushed to a foreign hospital. Do you panic? Do you rush to his side? Or do you pause, calculate, and ask, is it real this time? Because by then, the water had already been muddied. Thomas had already claimed a heart attack before the wedding, and some said that was a lie. Others believed it. But in either case, the story had changed. The trust was gone. And now, a new emergency was unfolding, one that no one could ignore. The 911 call came at 9:21 p.m. Neighbors had heard a thud, a crash. Thomas reportedly collapsed near the kitchen counter, clutching a chair before hitting the tile. An ambulance arrived 11 minutes later. By then, he couldn't speak. His mouth twisted, his left eye twitching, unable to answer basic questions. The paramedics thought it might be a stroke, but they needed scans to confirm. He was rushed to the nearest hospital, just across the border, in San Diego. The next 24 hours were chaos. Doctors confirmed it was an ischemic stroke caused by a clot. They administered blood thinners, began physical assessments, and placed Thomas in a semi-private recovery room. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because despite Thomas's inability to speak, hospital staff reported he kept gesturing to a notepad, scribbling words. One nurse later revealed he wrote Meghan repeatedly, underlined, circled, desperate. He wanted her, not a lawyer, not a doctor, not Samantha, not TMZ, just Meghan, the daughter who had vanished from his life 4 years ago. And now, he was pleading with nurses to call her. But here's the gut punch. No one knew how to reach her. There was no emergency contact on file, no assistant number, no press agent who answered. Even the British consulate was reportedly confused. Meghan and Harry weren't technically royals anymore. They weren't bound by the palace. They weren't bound by anything. And so, the only way to reach her was the media. That's when the headlines began. Thomas Markle hospitalized after stroke. Meghan's father pleads to see her. Final goodbye? Sources say Thomas can no longer speak. The story exploded. And for the first time in a long time, Meghan reacted. Not publicly, but internally, something shifted. We know this because security sources confirmed an inquiry was made to the hospital. A lawyer reportedly called under a private name, asked about visitor protocols, wanted to confirm Thomas's location. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a rush to her father's side. But it was something. The world waited. And then, it happened. An unmarked black vehicle arrived at the hospital 2 days later. Security got tense. The lobby was cleared. And staff, peeking through doorways, saw her. Hair pulled back. Dark clothes. Sunglasses. Meghan Markle. In the flesh. Walking toward the ICU. She didn't bring flowers. She didn't bring Archie. Or Lilibet. She brought only herself. And the weight of 4 years of silence. Nurses whispered. Orderlies stopped pushing carts. One doctor, who had only known Thomas for 2 days, said he felt a strange tension enter the air. It wasn't just emotional. It was theatrical, because Meghan didn't slip in unnoticed. She moved with the calm, deliberate grace of someone who knew all eyes were on her.